Sennheiser's HD660S2 will be made publicly available on February 21st. A lot has stayed the same, but let's go over some of the differences and upgrades that we see in the technical design in the S2. For one, the 660S2 features a new voice coil that is 10% lighter than the one found in the S1. Airflow around the driver has been optimized, allowing for less leakage and greater sensitivity. We also see a change in impedance. The S2 is 300 ohms, while the S1 was 150 ohms. Finally, we see a new tuning, with more bass and more treble. Now, let's take a look inside the box. You get your HD660S2 headphones, a soft carrying pouch, a 1.8 meter cable with a 4.4 millimeter balance jack, a cable of the same length with a 6.35 millimeter unbalanced jack, and a 6.35 to 3.5 millimeter adapter. As usual, let's start with look and feel. When it comes to the differences between the S1 and the S2, there isn't a whole lot there in terms of fit. Same sort of, very lightweight headphone, very strong clamp pressure, same sort of plastic frame, and thankfully the same velour ear pads. Overall, I think if you did an A-B comparison wearing the 660 S2 and what we can now call the S1 on your head, I don't think that you would really be able to feel much of a difference, or maybe any difference at all. There are some minor changes in the look. The 660 S1 had more of like a silvery metallic sort of color going on with the fonts on it, like the Sennheiser and the Sennheiser logo and the HD660 running along the side. All of those were in this like silvery sort of steely color. The S2 now has this like bronze copper color. It's this warmer color, and I think it's fitting because I think that the S2 is a warmer sounding headphone, but get into that in a second. I actually think that the biggest differences with the S2 as far as like how it feels and how it handles really has more to do with what comes with it. So the S1, for example, came in this big bulky box that I have here. You can see has these metal hinges on it, very like professional, storage kind of box. The S2 comes with this much softer case. It's just, a little carrying case, much flimsier, also much more portable. That box isn't really something that you can take with you. And then on top of that, the cables are also much shorter with the S2. They're 1.8 meters now, as opposed to the 3 meter cables that came with the S1. Overall, I feel like the accessories that come with it, they're a little more casual. You don't have to worry about really wrapping up the wire or tripping over the wire. You can throw them in the bag and then put that in your backpack. So a little more on the go and a little more mobile. And I think that that's the bulk of the changes that we're seeing as far as the fit goes. Now, there are also design changes that took place on the technical front, but I went over that in the intro to the video. So if you skipped that and you want to hear it, now's your time to go back. So moving on to soundstage. I would say that overall, the soundstage that we hear with the S2 is very similar to the S1. That's not where you're going to hear the bulk of the changes. We're going to have to talk about balance to really get at the heart of the changes. But I still thought that there were some subtle but noticeable differences, and I would say upgrades with the S2's soundstage. I was trying to explain in my written review in words what I can now gesticulate to you with my hands, which is basically that the S1 had a little more of an ovular soundstage to me, where the S2 I think has a little more of a circular one. And I mean that as in when parts start panning to the side, they keep a little more distance with the S2, whereas the S1, they start approaching your face. And then also on top of that, I was listening to the S2 a lot more today before filming this review, and I think that it reaches further back. Like I was listening to Emotional Eternal, an album by Melody's Echo Chamber, and there are a lot of string parts in that album that are very widely panned, and I heard those more to the side on the S1, where on the S2 I feel like I very distinctly felt them kind of like traveling over my shoulder. I don't want to emphasize this soundstage difference too much though. It's something that I think you have to be paying pretty close attention to. So yeah, overall, soundstage differences, subtle, noticeable, but fundamentally it is still the 660. Now, getting into balance, frequency response graphs don't always tell the full story, but I think in the case of the 660 S2 versus the S1, they do a pretty good job telling the story. So I'm going to be referring to those fairly frequently for this coming part. So I think one of the most hyped things about the S2 was that it has more extension on its sub bass now. And I think that when people saw that, when Sennheiser released the frequency response chart for the S2, it was met with a mix of excitement. More bass is more fun, and that's exciting. And I think also a little bit of cautious curiosity, people seeing a little more sub bass and saying, is this still truly a reference tuning? And before I get into the details, I would say, yes, it is absolutely still a reference headphone. And actually, I think that this bass extension makes it sound even more realistic and also makes it sound more fun. If there was one criticism that I had to give to the 660, and I can feel people sharpening their knives right now, don't worry, I still liked the S1 of the 660. But I did feel like it rolled off its bass a little too mercilessly. And in general, for reference headphones, the idea is you don't want something too boomy, you don't want something that's, covering up the rest of the balance. But if you look at the S2, it's still rolling off that sub bass. It's still rolling off the mid bass, just not as sharply as the S1 was. And the fact that it still rolls it off, but it also amplifies it, I think is just, it works that balance really well. And it's more realistic in the sense that, subs are still a part of the mix. You should still be hearing subs pretty prominently. I understand the concern with having them, overpower a balance. I feel like you do hear that a lot, but that's not what the S2 is doing. It brought them up a moderate amount, enough to, I think, notice it. If you currently have an S1, you will, I think, definitely hear the difference with the S2's low end as well as high end. I'll get to that though. I think it's a more modern tuning. I think it's more suited for more modern genres, which, frequently do have like a throbbing sort of sub bass going on with it. And, the S2 is able to represent that, I think, very accurately without, detracting from the rest of the balance. There weren't any moments with the S2 where I felt like it was boomy or muddy or anything like that. And then also on just a pure enjoyment level, I think that the newfound low end and growl and rumble on the S2 works really well with its physical design. In the sense that the velour ear pads do a really good job transmitting those vibrations. And then on top of that, there's a really tight clamp pressure that's, pressing those velours right against your head. So there's a nice emphasis and reinforcement of those vibrations that comes from the physical design as well. Now, when it comes to mids balance, I think this is where I might have the least to say, because to my ears, this is what the two headphones have the most in common, which I think is a good thing. I think that the really balanced, natural, clean sounding mids on the S1 contributed a lot to making it the popular headphone that it became. And I'm glad to say that the S2 keeps that going, has very flat mids, very natural sounding mids. Now, I know looking at the frequency response chart, it would look like there is more of a low mids heavy balance going on. And, I guess technically that's true. But to my ears, I heard these low mids as more of an extension of the stronger low end that we have now. I didn't really hear the new, minor amplitude bump in the low mids as contributing to the mids profile. I heard it more as going along with the low end profile. So on the one hand, I would say that the low mids boost isn't a super noticeable feature. In general, the mids profile is still sounding a lot like the S1. And on the other hand, technically the low mids boost actually made the mids profile even more flat, even more balanced. So I think it's a win-win. You basically get the same sound as the S1, and technically, maybe on some subconscious level or just a technical level in general, which maybe is more important if you're choosing to mix with the 660 S2, it is technically a flatter mids balance now. Now, something that I don't see getting talked as much about as the bass profile on the S2 is the treble profile on the S2. And that's interesting to me because I thought that the changes in the treble response on the S2 were equally as noticeable and impactful as the changes that we're seeing on the low end on the S2 as well. There are two major changes to the treble that we're seeing with the S2 if we look back over at the frequency response chart. One is there's a good deal more extension and amplitude on the really high highs. And by that, I mean, above 10 kilohertz. And then the other change that we see that I think is interesting and maybe a little controversial is there is more amplitude at 7 kilohertz on the S2. The S1 cut 7 kilohertz significantly more than the S2 does. And there are a few interesting things here. 7 kilohertz is on the upper end of where you might hear like a coarse, hissy sort of sound. For example, when I'm mixing and I have to de-ess, or I'm taking the sibilants out, or to further explain that, the tss, k, s sort of sounds, I'll frequently go to 7 kilohertz and create a very sharp and narrow drop. And usually, if it's not 7 kilohertz, if I play around somewhere in that area, I'll be able to reduce the hissy effect. So 7 kilohertz is a pretty important part of the frequency spectrum. It's also in that range. I would generalize between 3.5 kilohertz to maybe 8 kilohertz, where our ears are just anatomically more prone to amplifying that sound to our brains. So it's a sensitive area for our ears. And even though I used sibilants as an example, I wouldn't say that there's harsher sibilants really on the S2, but I would say that sounds like hand claps or snaps or just like snappy percussive sounds. They're a lot more aggressive. There's a bit more bite going on with the S2, and I think that you can definitely attribute that to what we're seeing around 7 kilohertz. I mentioned in my written review that the bass response might get you excited and might make you want to, pump the volume up a little louder. But I think that the little extra amplitude that we're seeing in the mid treble might make you bring the volume back down to where you would usually listen to it. So that is another consideration for the mid-treble boost, how loud you listen to your music. Less controversially, I think more people are really going to be into what's going on beyond 10 kilohertz. That extra extension, that extra amplitude in that range, I think gives just a really pleasant airiness and smoothness to the treble. Also just generally gives it a more lifting and realistic sound, and also a more spacious sound. I feel like maybe in part what made the S2 soundstage sound just a little bigger to my ears could in part be because of this treble extension. So overall, to recap, I think that the soundstage, maybe it's debatable, but to my ears, I think that it wraps around a little more than the S1. The low end still keeps it reference quality. It's still not, it's not blasting the low end by any means, but there's a really nice rumble that's carried out through the velour ear pads, and then also the tight grip pressure, I think really maximizes that sort of vibratory feeling going on with the newfound subs. Mids profile, mostly the same on paper. It's actually a little more balanced because now that there's less of an intense roll off going on with the bass, there's a little more low mids is keeping things more flat. But again, like I was saying, to my ears, I heard the low mids as more informative to what I was hearing in the low end than really changing what I was hearing in the mid range. I think mid range mostly stays the same. And then high end, more aggressive, that extra amplitude around 7 kilohertz, I think is a really important part to the sound that the 660 S2 has. Is able to pack a little more pain, I think, than the S1 was able to. And then on top of that, there's also more treble extension as well, is more detailed in the high end than the S1 was for that reason alone. It's just more airy, and that airy quality, I think, also gives it a little more of a spacious quality. Overall, I think Sennheiser did justice to the 660 S2. I don't think anybody wanted to see really, really serious changes getting made. This is, I think, a darling in the headphone world. People would be very upset if it sounded too different. It doesn't sound too different, but I think it sounds just different enough. I definitely think that 660 owners, current S1 owners, it's worth checking out the S2. It is a different enough tuning for you to have a different listening experience with it. Basically the same classic with more modern, more fun, and I also think more accurate tuning as well. Well, this was a little bit of a treat getting to hear the 660 S2 before its official release. I have more reviews coming this week. I'm going to be doing a lot of really cool amps and also DACs coming up, especially the DACs. I think you guys will want to tune in for that one. Got something special for that video. I'm going to put a link for you to pre-order the HD 660 S2 from the Audio 46 online store down below. I'm also going to put a link to the 660 S1 down below. I don't know how long those are going to last. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, remember to like and subscribe. So anyway, this is Chris with Major Hi-Fi, and I'll see you soon.